Lecture 4. In this lecture, we will be looking at slides 31 through 43. So please locate yourself at slide 31. Here we intend to address the second and third sermons of Haggai. These are going to occupy chapter 2 of Haggai, most of chapter 2 of Haggai, all the way down through about verse 19. Slide 32. Haggai's first oracle stimulated the people to action. It had been 16 years since they had worked on the temple. During this time, they had been quite discouraged, quite disillusioned, and eventually became indifferent and apathetic. But in Haggai's first sermon, which is recorded in chapter 1, Haggai urged them that the Lord was with them. He stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel and the spirit of Joshua and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. And finally, after this long 16-year hiatus, they once again began to work on the house of the Lord, the temple. Now, in the second sermon, Haggai is going to assure them of the worthiness of the project. His first sermon had occurred about a month earlier. But now we are in the 21st day of the 7th month, and Haggai is going to preach again. Now, it's very important that when you look at the first verse of chapter 2 of Haggai, that you notice it talks about the 7th month. Ordinarily, probably most Bible readers pass over those kinds of references without much attention. But in fact, the 7th month should clue you that this was a very significant period. For one thing, this is the most important festival month of the Jews. And because of the festivals of the 7th month, the work on the temple that had begun a month earlier would now be delayed because of the celebrations. There was the Feast of Trumpets on the first day of Tishri, which is the first day of the 7th month, eventually, which would be called Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. Then, a week and a half later, there is Yom Kippur, the National Day of Atonement. This is the day when the high priest would enter the most holy place twice, once with blood for himself and once with blood for the people. This is the day in which the scapegoat would be driven into the desert as a sin bearer of the sins of the nation. And then finally, on the 15th through the 21st, there would be a week-long festival, the Festival of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, or Booths, as it is sometimes translated. This was a festival in which the people camped out in small arbors with their families to commemorate the sojourn in the wilderness all the way back in the time of Exodus. So the festivals of the 7th month would have preoccupied the people so that they would have left off the building of the foundation for the festival month, at least for the most part of it. And Haggai wanted to be sure that they did not lapse back into their former apathy. And so on the 21st day of the 7th month, which actually is going to be the last day of the Feast of Booths, Haggai once again addresses the leaders and the people, and he urges them. And the Lord speaks to him and said to Zerubbabel and to Joshua and to the remnant of the people that they must continue this work. Slide 33. The question that Haggai posed to them is, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? Certainly, if you read the end of Ezra chapter 3, you'll discover that there were people who had seen Solomon's temple before the exile. They had been old enough to remember what it looked like. Then they had gone into exile for several decades, and now they are back in Jerusalem looking at the rubble and the destructive elements that were left from the temple after the Babylonians had burned it. And they were, quite frankly, pretty disappointed. And so the question is asked, what does it look to you like now? Doesn't it seem to you like nothing? Certainly there were people who spanned both sides of the exile, who had lived in Jerusalem prior to the exile and now had come back to Jerusalem after the exile. In fact, here on slide 33, there is a very important inscription in Aramaic from the early Second Temple period, written in Old Hebrew script. It is commonly called the Mattathias inscription by scholars. And in this inscription, it describes one of the Jews who had been in Jerusalem prior to the exile and who had returned with those who came back to Jerusalem after the exile. And so it says, I, Abba, the oppressed and persecuted, born in Jerusalem, went into exile in Babylonia, and brought back Mattathiah, a son of Judah. Mattathiah, incidentally, is probably his father, and he buries him in a cave which he acquired by the writ. Now, we don't have any more information about this particular incident or this particular person. And so far as we know, this is not a person who is directly mentioned in the Bible. But it does corroborate the statement that is in Ezra, that there were people who were in Jerusalem before the exile who had seen Solomon's temple and were now returned to Jerusalem after the exile and watching as the foundation stones were being laid. And so the question is asked here in Haggai, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? And what does it look to you now? Doesn't it seem like nothing? And yet, in spite of this, Haggai is going to encourage them to continue the work. So he says, be strong, O Zerubbabel. Be strong, Joshua. Be strong, you people of the land, for I am with you, declares Yahweh. Slide 34. In this second sermon, Haggai is going to encourage them along 5 lines. First of all, he's going to reaffirm what was said in his first sermon, that God was with them. Back in chapter 1 and verse 13, Yahweh had declared, I am with you. This is in Haggai's first sermon. Now Haggai picks up this same theme again in chapter 2 and verse 4. I am with you, declares Yahweh Sabaoth. So if they're going to work on this temple, they need to know that they are not working alone. They are working under the inspiration and the direction of Almighty God. Secondly, Haggai reminded them that they are still members of the covenant. The covenant had not been destroyed in spite of the exile. And so it says in verse 5, this is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit remains among you. Do not fear. The exile, therefore, did not destroy the covenant. The covenant that God had given them through Moses at Mount Sinai was not dead. It was still alive. And the exile notwithstanding, they were still the covenant people of God. And the covenant regarded the land and regarded the building of the temple. That ancient covenant had promised them that God would give them this land, and this land was still theirs. Secondly, that covenant had indicated that when they came into that land and they had rest from their enemies, that they were to build a sanctuary in the place that the Lord would choose. Now they are rebuilding that sanctuary. Of course, this is the second temple, but it still is part of that covenant that was given all the way back in the time of Moses. Third, Haggai urged them that in this building project, they had a stake in God's future. Verse 6, this is what Yahweh Sabaoth says, in a little while I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations. The fact that God had a future, and that future involved the building of the temple, ought to inspire the people that they needed to continue this work. Their work on the temple was not a waste of time. It was not simply an exercise in futility. It was actually part of God's eschatological future, what God intended to do in the future. Fourth, God promised that this rebuilding of the temple was linked to the desire of the nations that would fulfill Ezekiel's prediction that the glory of God would return. You'll remember, of course, that in Ezekiel's oracles, the early chapters, he described the abandonment of the temple by the glory of Yahweh. The glory lifted up from the most holy place, and it passed through the inner curtain and through the second curtain, and finally through the eastern gate and disappeared to the east with the exiles in Babylon. So the abandonment of the temple, the abandonment of the glory of God in the temple, when the glory of God left the temple, meant that temple would be destroyed. But Ezekiel had come back to that theme in the latter part of his book. After Jerusalem had fallen and the refugee had returned to Babylon to give them the news that the city was fallen and the temple had been burned, Ezekiel now began to predict that the glory of God would return to the temple, the same glory that had been there the first time. Haggai now picks up on this very same theme. And he says that the glory of Yahweh that had been in the temple of Solomon, that had been so strong that the priest could not even minister, that glory was now going to return to the second temple. And so Yahweh declared, the glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house. This is the fifth encouragement, that the splendor of the second temple would be greater than the splendor of the first one. Going back to the question that Haggai had posed, which of you remember how that former house looked? And which of you are looking at this foundation thinking that this doesn't look like very much? This looks like hardly more than anything. And yet, in this second temple, there would be a splendor and a glory greater than the first one. It's hard not to believe that embedded within Haggai's promise that the desire of the nations would come and that the splendor of the second temple would be greater than the splendor of the first one, that Haggai has in mind the coming of the Messiah. For it is not simply in the architecture that the second temple would be greater than the first one. Rather, it would be in the one who would come to that temple, and that would be the Messiah himself. Slide 35. It's important to spend a moment or two looking at the translation of Haggai chapter 2 and verse 7. This particular verse presents us with a grammatical problem in the Hebrew text in that it has a singular subject but a plural verb. When translators come across passages like this, and it's not very often, but it does happen on occasion, generally they will have to treat either the singular part as dominant or the plural part as dominant. So in this particular passage, if the plural verb is given priority, then the entire phrase is pluralized. And you will see this in some of the English translations of the Bible. The Revised Standard Version, for instance, which speaks of the treasures of the nations, in the English Standard Version, and the New American Bible, not to mention the American Standard Version, which is an older English translation. But all of these give the plural verb the priority, and so they will translate the entire phrase as a plural. On the other hand, if the singular subject is given priority, then the phrase will become entirely singular. The King James Version does this, for instance, with its translation of the desire of all nations. And the NIV follows that very closely by the desired of the nations, or the one who is desired of the nations, which also follows the Latin Vulgate. The treasure of all nations is the way the New Revised Standard Version renders it. But in these cases, the singular subject is given priority. There is no way to certainly resolve this kind of translation problem. And so as you look at the different English translations, you will notice these differences. In Hebrew, the subject and the verbs typically agree. And so usually, if there's a singular subject, there's a singular verb. If there's a plural subject, there's a plural verb. But in this case, with a singular subject and a plural verb, the translator has to decide which way he's going to go. But in either case, both of these translations, whether you go the route of the singular translation or the plural translation, both of these translations are messianic. The singular, if you follow that particular translation, refers to the Messiah himself. The desire of all nations, the treasure of nations, probably refers to the Messiah. In fact, this is the way a number of Christmas carols will take it, if they refer back to this passage in the book of Haggai. Come, O come, desire of nations, for instance, one of the Christmas carols sings. And that, of course, presumes that it's talking about the Messiah. On the other hand, if you translate it in a plural way and you talk about the treasures of the nations, or the precious things of the nations, you still are talking about the Messianic age. It is in the coming of the Messiah that all of the nations will turn to the Lord. And so, in either way, Haggai is emphasizing that those people who are building the second temple, those people who are working on the foundation, they have a stake in God's future. And that future is a Messianic future, for the one that God had promised would surely come. Slide 36. Now we come to Haggai's third sermon. This one begins in chapter 2 and verse 10 and goes through verse 19. This one is a couple of months later, We're now in the winter months, or the late fall, early winter months. And Haggai again addresses the community by using a defilement ruling as an illustration of their attitudes of disillusionment and indifference. When you first read this, you may be a bit puzzled as to what this is actually about, because the word of Yahweh came to Haggai on the 24th day of the 9th month, and this was the question that was posed. This is what Yahweh Sabaoth says. Ask the priests what the Torah says. If a person carries consecrated meat in the fold of his garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? In other words, if a person has a piece of meat that has been dedicated to the Lord, part of a sacrificial dedication, and the priest carries that in his garment, and it accidentally touches something else, his garment touches something else, does the other thing that was touched become consecrated? And the priest answered, no. The reason is that holiness does not translate by secondary contact. Then the follow-up question is the reverse of the first one. If a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? So let's suppose that a family has a death in it, an uncle or some other family member has died, and of course they're obliged to bury them. Touching a dead corpse renders a person ceremonially unclean. And there are certain rituals that are described back in the book of Leviticus that would have to be performed, and there were several days' wait that had to be performed before that person could be considered clean again. So let's suppose a person does in fact touch a corpse, perhaps even in the line of family duty. And then if that person touches one of these other things, such as some bread or stew or wine or oil or some other food, does that secondary contact cause defilement for what is touched? And the priests answered, yes, it does become defiled. So while holiness cannot be translated by secondary contact, defilement, on the other hand, is transmitted by secondary contact. Now the point of this illustration then is really described in verse 15. Give careful thought to this day and from now on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. And then, of course, the implication is you should consider it from this day how things are going to be in the future. For 16 years, this community have been apathetic, they've been disillusioned, they've been indifferent. Basically, what has been spreading among them has not been holiness, but bad attitudes. Now, when Haggai talks about, so it is with this people in this nation, whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled. This is in verse 14. He is not merely talking about sacrifices, but he's talking about their mindset. He's talking about their attitudes. They need to think about what has happened to them in this past 16 years. They have abandoned the work on the temple of the Lord. They have not gone forward with it. And yet, what has been spreading among them are attitudes of disillusionment, attitudes that are apathetic. But now there is a day, is like a line in the sand. Give careful thought to this day, Haggai says, this 24th day of the 9th month. This day, things are going to change, because this day is a line of demarcation between the past and the future. Slide 37. This day separates what had gone on before from what is going to happen in the future. In the past 16 years, again and again, they have met with quite severe drought, quite severe mildew, spoilage of their stored food. They've experienced destruction by weather. All of these things were judgments upon them, actually, because of their refusal to continue the work on the house of the Lord and because of their broken covenant. These previous things are judgments that are described in some detail in Deuteronomy chapter 28. And in Deuteronomy 28, things like blight and mildew are in fact judgments from God because of covenant violation. So what has happened in the last 16 years has been covenant violation. It has been not holiness. and what has been spreading among the people are bad attitudes. Blight has happened to their crops while they were still in the field, such as disease or insects like locusts. Mildew has happened in their storage pits, where their grain has been stored or their wine has been stored in jars. Hail has happened to the crops, in which the hail has beat down the tender shoots so they could not grow or be harvested. And all of this is regulated as signs of judgment. In fact, the law of mildew, which invaded their storage areas, is regulated very carefully in Leviticus 14. You may want to have a look at that passage. Now, however, from the 24th day of the 9th month, there's going to be a line of demarcation. What's happened in the past will not happen in the future. All of the bad attitudes and the judgments of the past could be safely relegated to the past. And from this day forward, this day, give careful thought to this day. From this day forward, it's going to be different. In the past, when they came to 20 measures, they discovered only 10 of them were good. When they went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, less than half of it was usable. And all of this was struck with blight and mildew and hail, because you did not turn to me, declares Yahweh. But verse 18, from this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of Yahweh's temple was laid. Give careful thought. This is the beginning of a new future. We'll spend just a moment or two talking about storage methods related to ancient times. As you look at slide 38, you will see two photographs. The one on the left is an archaeologist who was excavating some large storage jars, which are called collar rim jars, because of the rim at the top of the jar. And then in the photograph on the right, you will see one of those has been restored. In fact, if you look at it carefully, you will see the various cracks and fissures in this jar. It was not excavated as a single jar. It was excavated in pieces. But the archaeologists have fitted it together sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. And on the left side of the jar, you will see some lighter areas which are really plaster, which are fillers to fill in gaps in which the pieces or shards from the broken jar were not found. These kinds of jars were used to store wine. It was very important that they're sealed very tightly at the top to prevent spoilage. And so in Haggai's description, he says someone might come to a wine vat, such as this wine jar, or maybe a series of wine jars, such as you see lined up in the photograph on the left. And when they went to those, they discovered that less than half of them were usable because the others had been invaded by spoilage. Then in the next slide, slide 39, you will see some descriptions and photographs of grain pits. Grain was generally stored in the ground in a pit which was either lined with stone or lined with lime plaster. Archaeologists at Tel Halif have experimented with some of these storage pits to just see how well they preserve grain, and they've copied the pattern of ancient Jewish storage pits and created some of their own. In the diagram on the bottom left of this slide, you will see three kinds of pits. There is a bottle-shaped pit with a round bottom, which is lined with rock. Then grain is stored in there, and the archaeologists sealed it over and put a thermometer in it. The thermometer is important because it registers the temperature of the grain, and if there is spoilage and if there is organic activity among the grain, such as mildew or the buildup of gases, then this would register on the thermometer. Immediately below that, you will see a balloon-shaped pit, very similar to the top one, except its shape is different. The top is sealed after the grain is stored in it, and the thermometer is inserted within the pit. And then finally, the third pit is a bell-shaped pit, which is more of a flat bottom, but again sealed at the top with a thermometer in it. Dr. John Currid, the archaeologist who presents these diagrams, shows us how this worked, and they allowed this grain to be in the storage pit for 4 to 6 months, monitoring the temperatures and just seeing how well it stored grain. And in fact, it stored grain very, very well, so long as the seal was solid and the lining of the grain pit was intact. The photograph at the top right shows an excavation of layers of strata in which there is a grain pit in the seam of this pit, which is about a little bit to the right of center. You can also see a small meter stick for measurement, and there are some small tags that appear to be very tiny rectangular spots in the photograph. These are archaeological labelings. Because it's kind of difficult to see in the photograph, Dr. Curd has provided an actual drawing of this strata, and if you compare the drawing underneath the photo, you can relate back between the two, and you can see how the long, narrow entrance to the pit ends up with a balloon-shaped pit in the bottom, and then there's some other elements in the strata. So this is the kind of thing that Haggai is talking about when he talks about the storage areas of the Jews being struck by mildew. Now, however, with a new beginning, the 24th day of the 9th month, this spoilage will end. The wine vats will not spoil, the grain storage will not spoil, but from the time that the foundation of the Lord's temple was made, there is going to be a new future, and God would bless the people. So they have a new date, slide 40. This date can be calculated with some certainty to be December the 18th, 520 BC. And this is the date between the past and the future. The question is then asked in verse 19, is there any seed left in the barn? Again, without some local knowledge of farming practices of that time, you may not understand the import of this question. But it really relates to the fact that seed was sown in the late fall for the next season. Now, this is different than modern agriculture. Typically, in modern farming, fields are plowed in the spring, and then the sowing is done in the spring as well. But in ancient Israel, fields were plowed and the seed was sown in late fall. Then the seed would lie in the ground through the winter months and would germinate in the spring. So the question, is there any grain left in the barn, should be answered no, because by this time, the 9th month, which is already in December, we've already passed the time when seed should be sown. And so all of the seed that had been in the storage areas had been sown in the fields already. And now the promise was that they could expect an excellent harvest in the spring. Because of this line of demarcation, this 24th day of the 9th month, the future was bright with promise, and things would begin to grow in the future that they had not seen for 16 years. The fig trees would bear well. The pomegranate trees and the olive trees would bear fruit in abundance that they had not seen before, because this was the beginning of the future. From this day on, God said, I will bless you. Slide 41. This shows a farmer. This is actually a modern picture, but it does show an Israeli farmer sowing seed by hand in a plowed field. And this would have been done in the fall, allowing the seed to remain in the ground until spring. Slide 42. If you look at the months here and you go down to the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, this is the month of November and December. And if you look in the 3rd column of the seasons, you'll see that this is the plowing and the sowing season in ancient Palestine. Slide 42. There is an interpretive question between Ezra 3 and Haggai 2 that we ought to look at. And it has to do with the fact that there seem to be 2 dates for the laying of the foundation of the temple. Ezra 3 puts this date 16 years earlier. Now in Haggai it says that on the 24th day of the 9th month, this is the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. So there's a 16-year difference between these 2 books. Critical scholars, particularly those who do not view Scripture as being the Word of God, generally charge one or the other account with error. They say either the book of Ezra is wrong or the book of Haggai is wrong. But I'm not sure that that is necessary. I think one of 2 other alternatives is probably a better solution to this problem. In the first place, there may have been 2 foundation-laying ceremonies. Back in Ezra chapter 3, there certainly was a ceremony connected with the beginning of the laying of the foundation. And now in Haggai, there seems to be another celebration, this 24th day of the 9th month. But it's quite possible that both of these are referring to the same thing, and that what is happening in Haggai is really a rededication of the temple foundation and a ritual purification. because it is laid dormant for 16 years. On the other hand, Haggai may simply be referring to the restoration of the building in general. We don't actually know whether the temple foundation was totally completed in Ezra chapter 3. Perhaps it was largely completed, but then there may still have been some work to be done. And so what Haggai may refer to is the actual final completion work of the foundation that had been begun earlier. But in either case, it is probably unnecessary to charge either the book of Ezra or the book of Haggai with an error. It's better to simply look at these two as being describing the same thing, but 16 years apart. This is the end of lecture 4.